Welcome back to the Blue Bench. I'm Georgia Hawthorne, the social media manager for the Montana Democratic Party.
And I'm Shannon O'Brien, former legislator, statewide candidate, and a former teacher.
Sweet. Well, at the federal level, the House GOP passed a budget in the dead of night last week. And it's definitely big, but beautiful? Not so much. With a late change, these morons double whammied Medicaid. And Montana is one of the states that will be heavily affected. What's the sitch on Medicaid now?
Right. Our budget and our tax system, but our budget and our revenue are really our priorities. They're how we express our priorities. Mm-hmm. And according to multiple sources, but certainly the Kaiser Family Foundation that does work on impacts of legislation in healthcare particularly, we're likely to see serious troubles for our Montana families. It looks like potentially 57,000 people could be affected by this, or depending on what the cuts are, there's a little over 25% of Montanans who are on Medicaid, and this is just going to hit really, really hard. And the other factor I think it's important is state spending then is increased per person by almost 50% because of this cut from the federal level. And it's going to hit us hard.
Right. And part of that budget, it implements new work requirements, more frequent eligibility checks, and all of those things are simply roadblocks to people getting that access to care. More people are going to be turned off of Medicaid coverage because of these work requirements than more people are going to get on Medicaid because of it. But like you were saying, Shannon, there are over 200,000 Montanans on Medicaid, and that includes regular Medicaid, but also Medicaid expansion. And so 200,000 is about 21%. And then 57% of that same number, we're looking at 10% of Montanans getting kicked off of their healthcare coverage. And honestly, this is a great reminder that Ryan Zinke and Troy Downing willingly threw every single one of us under the bus in this budget. And I'm not sure who they're representing here, but it damn sure isn't their constituent. If the feds are shifting costs to the state has to make that money up somewhere. And we've already seen a lot of debate around the state budget and the legislative session and all the issues that came around that. What options does the state have here?
Well, I just want to start by saying it could leave many people simply without healthcare coverage or exorbitant priced healthcare coverage. And I'm sporting a new accessory as of this morning. And when I was at Missoula Bone and Joint getting my new hand brace for my broken hand, I was so grateful that I wasn't worried about, I knew where I was on my very low deductible because I have really good health insurance and I'm so grateful for it. And I know that's anecdotal, but it's true. You know, I know of people who have not gone in for a hand injury that was probably a break,
right?
Because they just couldn't afford it. So I think that's, the basis that we need to keep in mind. So that said, we could look at upwards of 4%, if not more, of increase in state taxes to bring in the revenue.
Right.
Or we could also be looking at more substantial budget cuts. And, I think that the victim would most likely be education. And education, because it's a substantial part of the state budget, is already running on fumes. We have a major teacher shortage crisis that's happening. Teacher salaries are so low that they are sending teachers out of state so that they can sometimes close to double their salary in some of our surrounding states. And that's not an exaggeration.
Well, the way Republicans talk about these tax cuts, raising state taxes to give people some health care doesn't seem like all that bad of a trade-off to me, until I remember that they're lying and the tax cut isn't for me. It's only if you make already good money. There's been a lot of talk online about how this budget bill is essentially a redistribution of wealth from the bottom up. Can you explain what that looks like?
Yeah, that's truly what it is, redistribution of wealth. And those are long words, but simply put, it's let's give bigger tax cuts for the wealthiest at the burden of the lower income folks. So, and we've seen this over the course of the last couple of legislative sessions at the state level, and now we're certainly seeing it at the federal level. The state level, we've been seeing consistently, and this federal budget, we're seeing it as well. So on top of a 5,000 for people who are making, let's just say if you're making over $1 million a year, $2 million, $3 million a year, you're likely to see thousands of dollars increase in your pocket based on these tax cuts. If you are earning $50,000 a year, you are either likely to see an increase in taxes, or you, as you get a little bit higher, maybe to 100,000, you might see $70, $80, $90 period in your pocket, which, we calculated it out last legislative session that, $70 can get you a year's worth. I don't know what, a couple pounds of ground beef.
Yeah, get you like a couple of lunches, maybe.
It's just not. It's not what it is. And the idea is trickle down economics. And actually, I was just talking with an economist professor about, I said, can we talk a little bit about this concept of trickle down economics? The idea that you give the tax cuts to the wealthiest, and they will, with that money, hire more people to do things like work on their yachts, right, or invest in the economy, which would hire more people in their businesses. And it was Reaganomics, and economists all over the world have studied this now, and they know that it doesn't work. And so I am absolutely perplexed at why some people, meaning policymakers, want to disregard the research that shows that this doesn't work. And we can talk about the idea of confirmation bias, where you only seek your information from people that are going to confirm what you already believe. And that is a real phenomenon that takes place. But it sure doesn't solve the problems that Montana families are facing, which is housing, which is childcare, which is food on the table, and rent. So that's our job. In government, that's our job.
I don't want to speak for you, Shannon, but I'm kind of tired of the norm being we should depend on billionaires and their goodwill. We should depend on them doing the right thing if you want to have a good life. I hate that, but I'm also getting sick and tired of just, in general, rich white men thinking they get to control everyone's lives. Because right now, the Trump administration is currently on the warpath against higher education in general, really. The scapegoat that they're picking on right now happens to be Harvard. And there's no real reason for this, other than Harvard is kind of refusing to compromise their values and the quality of their education to kiss the feet of Donald Trump. But they've pulled essentially all of their federal funding and contracts. They're pushing a bill that would tax Harvard's endowment, which would run them about $850 million a year. They're banning Harvard from accepting international students. As a former teacher, alarm bells have to be going off in your head. What does this kind of action mean for higher education?
So this, to me, in the grand scheme, is one of the really highly concerning issues. When we start to control research and instruction, when I say we, when the president starts to control that arena, that's the First Amendment. And the concept of research, and I got to teach a graduate level research class, and it's really a method of controlling things to find out truth. And if we disallow that, and we control, or if the president makes an effort to control what is taught, how it's taught, and what research is done, therein lies true crime, in my humble opinion. That is where we get into really scary territory.
Right, because all of a sudden it's not facts or facts, it's what the president says is fact. is fact. And those are not equivalent statements. But on top of all of that, yesterday, Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced that they were going to be completely halting all applications for student visas for college students, but also exchange visas for high schoolers who come over and spend a semester, a year, sometimes even more than that. So this would essentially block any new international student from studying here in the States. But their reasoning for doing this is because they want to screen the applicant's social media. They've been able to do this, but this is also coming amongst social media searches in airports, social media searches at the border. And in those social media searches, they are generally looking for people who are saying pro-Palestine things, anti-Trump things, anything along that rhetoric, but fully blocking entry to the United States is what we're looking at here. You mentioned a little bit of authoritarianism-esque things right before this, and this just feels like we are sliding down that slope very quickly. What do you think?
You know, I think one of the most pure forms of learning is by way of travel and connecting with people who come from a different place, who speak a different language or not, but have different norms, have different ways of looking at life and looking at the similarities and looking at the differences. And we could go on and on about the value of these exchange programs. And to stop those is heartbreaking, I think, for the students and the families, and those experiences, but also the fundamental growth within citizens in the United States who don't have that. And using, as you mentioned, using that as an excuse is scary. And I'll just share that we've been planning for months now to have an exchange student come and live with us next academic year. And I was just texting the girl's father, who I happen to know, and they have an appointment with the embassy to apply for the visa, the interview. But we don't know. We don't know if it's going to work or not. Right. So that's a scary measure. That's another scary measure of blocking off our relations with other countries. And these are also, this is diplomacy. Lastly, I'll just share, I'm on the National Irish American Legislative Caucus, and we had a call with one of the ministers from the Irish Parliament, Minister of Commerce, to look at ways that we can bolster international commerce. And so fascinating. We had very cordial conversations before we officially began. It was all via Zoom. And she made some comments early on about, well, given the trade wars that are taking place now, and I'd been reading the papers and I was well aware of the tariffs and what was going on, but to hear an official from Ireland talking about the trade war that we had initiated, in Canada and all these other places that why would we pick a trade war, but why do we pick a war with these friends?
Right. I mean, we're just smacking our allies in the face repeatedly. Like, first it's tariffs, then we're not doing tariffs, and then we're doing the tariffs again. And also, by the way, your international students can't come here anymore because we don't trust them.
Yeah.
And that's just bad allyship. It's bad for diplomacy, especially when the U.S. is increasingly moving into this isolationist point. But anyways,
moving on.
I will not give you a lecture on international relations.
It's good. And it's so good to hear from you. You have a different, younger perspective than I do. And I think you're our future. And we've got to be figuring this out. Okay.
But I mean, these international students, they have a huge economic role in the U.S. They bring in billions of dollars of revenue every year. There's more than 1 million of them here just studying. Like, that's why they come here, is to study. And a lot of them end up staying here after they graduate, and they fill in major fields like tech and STEM, and those fields that the U.S. doesn't filter into as much.
That's right.
And so by potentially restricting these students from coming here, we're preventing them from graduating into our workforce and leaving gaps in it in the same time.
Yeah.
We could talk about the presidential circus probably all day long. But unfortunately for us, we've got a governor who's playing the same dangerous games. Governor Gianforte went on a huge veto spree last week, and they affect all kinds of different aspects of Montana life. Which ones are worrying you the most?
My bias is always education, so
I
I
know.
have to put that out there. But Senator Laura Smith had a bill that addressed inflationary adjustment, which is confusing for some folks, but schools are only allowed to have an increase in their budget for inflation of 3%, regardless of what inflation is. So 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, we saw upwards of 7% inflation rates. And so they're trying to just come up with that gap of, we'll say 5% on their own. So she introduced a bill to address that. And it passed well through both chambers. And then the governor said he vetoed it, and claiming that finances, it was a budget issue. And meanwhile he has 80 something $million kind of slush fund in his thing. So that was a huge potential damage to our children and our schools. So that's a big concern of mine.
And let me make sure I'm tracking this right, because there were a couple of bills that dealt with this inflationary cap. Was Senator Smith's bill the one that just said the legislature has the ability to change this number if they'd like? That's this bill, correct?
That's right. It didn't change the number. It didn't change. It just said legislators, the legislative body may address it.
So where is the budget concern if there's no money attached to it?
And the other piece that I want to point out is we're seeing significant increases in state revenue as people are moving to Montana and have higher salaries, which is our primary revenue source. And so income tax revenue is doing really well for our state. So don't tell me the money ain't there. There's another one that I was disappointed in. Representative Staffman introduced a bill that again went through both chambers well to make sure that Montanans have access to information that happens within the governor's office, which I worked in the governor's office. It was something that we always followed. We didn't delete emails. We stored them in case someone wanted to learn more about what discussions were were taking place. And he vetoed that. And I'll tell you, it's not as much that I mean, it's in principle. It's like, what are you hiding if you don't want to allow the public to know what's going on, and you want to be, it's certainly the appearance of something secretive is happening up there that is not cool and is of concern.
Right. And I mean, I went to journalism school, and Montana has some of the best right to know laws in the country. And a right to know law essentially says that the public gets to know what's going on in their government. You don't get to kick the press out. You don't get to say no to inquiries, like those kinds of things. And I believe all of this bill kind of stemmed from something a while back where people were requesting the governor's schedule to see where he was flying and if he was actually living in Helena and all of these things. And the governor's office essentially said, sure, and then gave them a document that was like 98% redacted. And so we've already seen little bits and pieces of what his office might be hiding. But I agree that the outright just like veto on a bill that is meant to hold you accountable to your constituents, it ain't a great look.
Well, and I think some of this, I wonder if some of this stemmed from a big flood, major flood that took place. And the governor happened to be on vacation out of the country, which in my humble opinion, I think a governor should be able to be out of the country if he or she, if they choose so.
I don't necessarily disagree.
I think there are some governors that choose not to go out of the United States. That's their business, whatever. But it was very secretive, day after day after day. Where's the governor? Where's the governor? Where's the governor? And so, and they just chose not, representatives from the governor's office chose not to answer the question.
Right. And meanwhile, like the whole town of Gardner is basically underwater.
I know. So just being aware, it's like, go to Europe, enjoy yourself.
Right. No one's saying that.
But just don't hide it and come on back when, there's a major natural disaster.
So among all of this, Medicaid has been like the word of the year, I think. I hear the word Medicaid at least 800 times a day. And a lot of that is on the federal level, but there's also impacts of all of these federal cuts on the state level. And I believe the governor also vetoed a handful of bills dealing with Medicaid, right?
So, I back up a little bit. We take care of our children and our infirm. Government, if it's doing its job, we educate and
Right.
we support what needs to take place, but we also make sure that our children and our sick are taken care of.
Right.
And let's get into preventative medicine too. But there are also people who have disabilities. And one of the bills Mary Cafaro introduced, Representative Mary Cafaro, who has been a champion for quality health care for Montanans for decades, introduced a bill that was designed to take excess Medicaid funds and make them available, kind of have a rainy day fund to make them available when the economy might be more difficult. And then another bill allowed for families to purchase Medicaid, and it actually increased the eligibility for family incomes in order to purchase Medicaid. And, it is not too much to expect your state government to help you with health care. And I know a person who had a little girl who was fighting cancer, and they went into their about 5 weeks into treatments, and they were handed a $300,000 bill after insurance took care of it.
And I mean, to your point about families trying to do all of it all of the time, that children with disabilities bill you mentioned, most of that is designated for in-home care. So if you had a child who was severely disabled and needed like an in-house nurse or something like that, I cannot imagine the price tag on that. Even if you do have some kind of private insurance, it has to be exorbitant. And at the same time, you're trying to pay the mortgage, you're trying to get groceries, you're trying to do all of those things. And Medicaid could severely reduce that burden for those families. And I don't understand what the governor thinks the other option is. Let the family go homeless? Because he's got a problem with homeless people too. I don't understand the logic.
I've heard, depending on the level of care, it could be anywhere between $3,000 to $6,000 per week to have in-home care come in. And
that's insane.
And who can do that? So respite care, and then you get these additional illnesses that come along with it if they're not getting the initial care, and then it becomes more expensive. So prevention.
And to this rainy day fund that he vetoed, it sure seems that, like, in a time where we're having all kinds of uncertainty around federal Medicaid dollars coming in, it feels like a really good time to maybe save some for later just in case. But he said no. So when these federal Medicaid cuts hit, he has no backup plan because he vetoed this bill. And we're back to talking about the other options we were talking about earlier, when he had a preventative option before any of this even hit the fan.
So let me make something real clear. And I'm not defending, let me finish it out. It is the legislature's job to come up with ideas that solve problems for Montana.
Totally.
And it is the governor's job to make sure that we have a balanced budget.
Okay.
And so these laws come through, and the governor meets with the budget director, who is a former legislator, and that team to really look at what is feasible and what will work. But herein, as we talked about earlier in the podcast, these are our priorities. And our priorities to give these major tax cuts to the wealthy, because
apparently.
Or is it to be responsible stewards of taxpayer dollars and serve the people of Montana responsibly with them, with those dollars? So I think that's a really important point to make, that it is his job, it's their job, that whole team, to make sure that there is money in the bank to do that. But let's not be doing these big tax cuts when property tax is kicking people out of their homes and we have ailments to fix.
I mean, I guarantee you that if you put the most straightforward poll to like every person in this state and you just said, would you rather give more money to rich people or pay for health care for children with disabilities with your taxpayer dollars, I don't think giving free money to rich people is going to win. And I hear you. I hear you about the governor having to keep a balanced budget.
Right.
And all of those things. And I understand the logic behind it. But like you mentioned earlier, the governor is sitting on an $86 million account that has like no regulations, and it's all interest from that all that COVID money that we got all those years back.
That's right.
He could easily just, here, we can take some money out of this instead of just nixing everything.
I know it.
So the budget concern thing doesn't really fly with me, but he also vetoed a whole lot more than those four.
Yes,
he shut down insurance coverage for hearing aids.
I know.
He shot down funding for firefighter training, a ban on styrofoam containers, and he also made this really weird video of him like drinking out of a styrofoam cup when he posted it. But I'll spare you guys. Can you give me some good news, please? Is that an option?
Let's get some good news. I'll tell you, the Montana Indian Caucus, American Indian Caucus, did amazing work. They really engaged so many people, legislators and non-legislators, to work hard. One of the big victories there were a number of victories, but one of them I'll point out is, we call it MICWA or ICWA. It's the Indian Child Welfare Act. And for decades, children in Indian country might have to be taken, for whatever reason, taken away from their families, which is something that we try to avoid. But if the parents aren't able to be parents, they would be taken away and put in most often in a non-native family. And so they're like stripped of their culture, stripped of their language, stripped of their connection to their family. So what the Indian Child Welfare Act really focuses on is keeping that connection alive and engaging tribal government with the Montana State Department of Public Health and Human Services and the family to find a way, ideally, to keep each child in that family or that extended family and to protect that, which is so, so important. So that was a big victory there. And there'll be, I'm sure, Senator Wendy Boy introduced that bill. He introduced it last session as well. And I'm sure that we'll see more and more of that coming out. We also saw Indian Education for All prioritized, which is a great program. It's really a stellar program at the national level. Montana is the star, and that helps all children understand the cultures.
Right.
And then for missing and murdered Indigenous people, we funding for training for teachers to be aware of that. Human trafficking is such a problem. So that was a great victory as well. So we saw a lot of good things come out that way.
Well, rural Montana also has a really big win coming their way. The St. Mary Siphon, which directs water, I don't really understand how it works. All I know is that it brings water to the High Line and gives water to over 18,000 Montanans, 140,000 acres of farmland. Like, that is the lifeline of the High Line, essentially. And that's scheduled to reopen early this summer after it blew out last year. And they weren't supposed to be back on schedule until earlier this fall. But President Biden and Senator Tester got funding for that project way back in 2021. What does this investment mean for rural communities, and how do Democrats get it done?
Huge issue, major problem when this blowout took place. And I did serve on agriculture, irrigation, and livestock committee and learned quite a bit about it. Paul Tuss is a representative up there in Havre and talked about how this has potentially the highest impact on the economy in that area. So 300 miles went dry of that river. And it created this huge challenge for farmers and ranchers, for the whole agriculture industry, to ensure the rationing, and had a major negative impact on production. And the Inflation Reduction Act that you made reference to, that Biden signed and testers worked on were what solved that problem. And I did find it interesting that Senator Daines and our other members of Congress did not support it, but we don't have to go into that. Mm-hmm. But, that's, in many ways where Tester was a champion when he served in the U.S. Senate yes, he's a dirt farmer, but he also knew how to work with Republicans and Democrats to get problems solved. So it's short of a miracle that they were on schedule and ahead of schedule to get that reopened, mm-hmm. and to get those agriculture industries back in business and drinking water as well.
Right, and I think that's the thing that anyone who works in the ag industry kind of needs to keep their eye on, is that the Inflation Reduction Act, which had initial money to just fix this project, because it was still fine at this time, like it was working as intended, but we knew that there were going to be updates and upgrades that we needed to make. And so Senator Tester got that money in the bill. President Biden signed it. Daines voted against it in the Senate. And then Tester was the one to secure more federal funding for the project when it did finally break.
Yeah.
And then, so you have Daines actively voting against it. Trump's funding freeze that he pulled earlier this year threatened all kinds of funding for this project. And so they didn't know if they were going to have contractors. They didn't know if they were going to have materials. And I think, when push comes to shove, those are your two options. You can have people who fight for you and understand how important this is to your life and your well-being, or you can have the alternative where they're just going to play games with your lives. But soapbox aside, before we wrap up, there's some important energy news for Montana customers. And this week we found out that without approval, without public notice, Northwestern Energy just decided to up and raise their rates 17%. It'll cost electric customers $204 a year on top of energy prices that are already high. But what can our listeners do about this?
First and foremost, I'll say it over and over again, get behind a can. Think about running. Most people shouldn't run because not everyone is cut out for it. Just like not everyone's cut out to be a nurse doctor, or whatever, or a teacher or whatever. But think about running, and then get behind a candidate that you believe in, and make sure that we have people who are looking out for Montanans' best interests to serve at any and all levels: school board, city council, legislature,
Public Service Commission.
Certainly the Public Service Commission. And this is, I think, a big issue that we have. So that's my number one response. And call them. I bet you know the number off the top of your head.
I did, because I was just putting it on a graphic yesterday. It's going to be 406-444-6150. All you got to do is call, leave a message, and say no more rate hikes for Northwestern Energy.
And the job of the PSC is to ensure that corporations who serve the public and are a monopoly, that they don't take advantage of us. It's just that simple.
I kind of feel taken advantage.
It really is just that simple. And when your rates go up 17%, and over $200 a year is not in the budget for so many Montanans. So make your phone calls, get behind candidates who will protect us, who will work for us, not corporations.
I think the thing is that we might not feel it right now because it's summer. It's really easy to keep your house somewhat cool, leave the door open, leave the window open, get a fan. You don't have to run the AC all the time. But come winter, when we all have to be running our heat at all times, or we will literally freeze, that's when we're going to feel this increase. And you keep mentioning that people need to call, and that's true, but if you need a little bit more sweet talk to make your phone call, the PSC is having a hearing for Northwestern Energy on June 9th, so call before then. But also, the PSC can force Northwestern Energy to A, lower that rate, and B, if they succeed in forcing them to lower the rate, they can also force Northwestern Energy to provide refunds with interest for that set of time where the rate was increased. So if you call and we get the decision that we all need, not necessarily that we want, that we need, you could also see money back in your pocket. And that phone call won't take long, but it could make a huge difference for you and your neighbors. But I think that's all we have today, Shannon.
I think that's all. But I want to tell our listeners, stay tuned. Join us next week when we're spending quite a bit of time of looking at all of the things that are going down in Washington, D.C. and how they impact Montanans, particularly rural areas. So stay with us. And lastly, Billings on Friday.
Yes.
If you can make it, tell us a little bit about what's going on there.
So we're having a town hall in Billings. It's open to anyone and everyone because that's kind of what public service is about. So we invited Senator Dane, Senator Sheehy, and Congressman Downing, who's the rep for the Eastern District. Dane said no in like record time, and Sheehy and Downing have essentially ghosted the organizers that asked. So they were invited. They're probably not going to be there. But we will, and we're going to have speakers, and we may have a really exciting speaker coming out this week, but stay tuned for that announcement. But make it to Billings with us if you can. It'll be Friday. Doors open at 6. Event starts at 7, and it'll be at the Billings Hotel and Convention Center. Anything else that we should let them know?
I think that's good for now.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us here on the Blue Bench, and check back in later for Gabby's